Welcome to Japan, an island nation that today dazzles the world with neon-lit cities, high-speed trains, and a deep sense of tradition. But long before the world knew of sushi or samurai, these volcanic islands floating in the Pacific Ocean were home to a much quieter, older story, one that began not with emperors or castles, but with a slow migration of people crossing ancient land bridges and settling in what we now call Japan. Japan's history stretches back more than 40,000 years. The earliest humans arrived from the Asian mainland, bringing with them basic tools, early farming knowledge, and survival skills suited for the forests, rivers, and mountains that make up the Japanese archipelago. These first people hunted, gathered, and later began cultivating rice, a staple that would shape Japanese life and identity for millennia. By around 300 BCE, Japan entered what's known as the Yayoi period. It was during this time that agriculture, metalworking, and pottery took off. Villages began to expand. Hierarchies started to form. And slowly, the scattered tribes of Japan began to turn into something more like a civilization. Fast forward to the 3rd century AD, and we find the emergence of the Yamato clan in the southern region of Japan. This powerful group managed to unite several regions under their control and laid the groundwork for what would become the imperial family, a line that, remarkably, continues to this day. The Yamato rulers began referring to themselves as emperors, though their real power at the time was still quite limited. From the very beginning, Japan was heavily influenced by its neighbors across the sea. China and Korea, far more advanced in writing, philosophy, and statecraft, passed many of their ideas across the water. The most significant of these was Buddhism, which arrived in 552 AD via Korea and eventually became a major part of Japanese spiritual life. At the same time, the Japanese elite began modeling their government after the Chinese imperial court, centralized, hierarchical, and steeped in ritual. In 645 AD, a sweeping series of changes known as the Taika reforms were introduced. These reforms aimed to centralize power, bring taxation under the emperor's control, and reshape Japan into a more organized state, again using China as a blueprint. Though these reforms looked good on paper, they didn't fully transform Japan overnight. In reality, local clans still held much of the real power. Then came a turning point in 794 AD. Emperor Kanmu decided it was time to settle the constant movement of the capital. He established a permanent seat of power in a city known as Heian-kyo, modern-day Kyoto. This decision launched the Heian period, which would last for nearly 4 centuries. It was a time of elegance and art, a golden age for the aristocracy. Court life in Kyoto was filled with poetry, calligraphy, and elaborate rituals. But behind all this beauty, the central government was growing weaker. As the aristocrats in Kyoto obsessed over etiquette and politics, they neglected the rest of the country. Local landowners, called daimyos, started rising in power. They had private armies of warriors known as samurai, and many stopped listening to the imperial court altogether. Japan was slowly drifting toward a feudal system. By the 1200s, this shift had reached a boiling point. 2 major clans, the Taira and the Minamoto, fought for control of the throne in a brutal conflict known as the Genpei War. After years of fighting, the Minamoto clan emerged victorious. In 1292, their leader, Minamoto no Yoritomo, persuaded the emperor to name him shogun, or supreme military commander. This wasn't just a fancy title. It marked the beginning of real military rule in Japan. Though the emperor remained a symbolic figure, true power had passed into the hands of the shogunate, based far from Kyoto in the coastal city of Kamakura. For the first time, Japan was being ruled by warriors, not courtiers. This new era, the Kamakura shogunate, lasted nearly 150 years. It was during this time that Japan would face one of its greatest external threats, the Mongol invasions. In the late 13th century, Kublai Khan, ruler of the vast Mongol Empire, demanded that Japan submit. When the Japanese refused, the Mongols launched two massive invasions in 1274 and again in 1281. Both invasions failed, not because of the samurai's strength alone, but because of freak typhoons that destroyed much of the Mongol fleets. The Japanese called these storms kamikaze, or divine winds, believing that the gods had protected their homeland. These legendary events would later carry symbolic meaning all the way into the 20th century. Still, the Mongol invasions weren't without cost. The war effort bankrupted the Kamakura shogunate, and many samurai were never properly compensated for their service. Discontent spread. In 1333, Emperor Go-Daigo tried to take back power, launching a rebellion that briefly restored imperial rule. But just 5 years later, a new military leader, Ashikaga Takauji, toppled the emperor and founded a new shogunate. This time, the shoguns ruled from Kyoto itself, in a more chaotic and less centralized way. Power remained fragmented, with different daimyos competing for land and influence. This period, known as the Ashikaga or Muromachi period, was marked by constant shifting alliances, violent uprisings, and a weakening central authority. By the 15th century, the situation had spiraled into near-total anarchy. In 1467, the Onin War broke out, a civil war over who should inherit the title of shogun. What followed was over a century of near-continuous conflict known as the Sengoku, or Warring States period. During this time, Japan was essentially carved up into hundreds of small, independent domains. Each one was ruled by a daimyo, and each had its own army. Despite the violence, this era also brought innovation. Ninjas began to play a covert role in warfare. Buddhist warrior monks joined battles. Castles were built. Tactics evolved. And then something unexpected happened that would change the future of Japan forever. In 1543, a Portuguese trading ship washed ashore on the island of Tanegashima. On board were firearms, guns the Japanese had never seen before. Within just a few decades, the daimyos began arming their samurai with muskets, fundamentally changing the way battles were fought. But the Portuguese brought more than weapons. They also introduced Christianity. Some daimyos converted, seeing it as a way to gain military support from European traders. The religion spread rapidly, especially in southern Japan. One powerful warlord who seized the moment was Oda Nobunaga. Using his military genius and the new gunpowder weapons, he began unifying the fractured states of Japan under one banner. Nobunaga was ruthless, strategic, and brilliant. But in 1582, just as he was nearing total control, he was betrayed and forced to take his own life. His work was finished by his loyal general, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, a man who rose from a humble peasant background to become the ruler of all Japan. Though he never claimed the title of shogun, Hideyoshi controlled the country as imperial regent. He brought peace, enforced social order, and even invaded Korea, hoping to expand Japan's empire. When Hideyoshi died in 1598, his young son was supposed to inherit power. But once again, rival daimyos fought for dominance. The final showdown came at the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600. The victor, Tokugawa Ieyasu, emerged as the most powerful man in Japan. In 1603, he was granted the title of shogun by the emperor, and with that, he established the Tokugawa shogunate. The capital of this new government wasn't Kyoto, it was Edo, a small city that would one day become Tokyo. Thus began the Edo period, a time of peace, isolation, and cultural flourishing that would last more than 2.5 centuries. But the rise of the Tokugawa shogunate wasn't just the end of war, it was the beginning of something entirely different. A Japan that would close itself off from the world, focus inward, and build the unique culture that still captivates the world today. In 1600, a decisive clash at the Battle of Sekigahara reshaped Japan. Tokugawa Ieyasu's forces crushed rival warlords, paving the way for him to be named shogun in 1603. This event marked the beginning of centuries-long military rule under the Tokugawa clan, headquartered far from the traditional imperial seat of Kyoto in Edo, modern-day Tokyo. Tokugawa Ieyasu and his successors, particularly Hidetada and Iemitsu, moved swiftly to tighten control. They implemented policies designed to limit rebellion and reinforce loyalty across the land. One such policy was Sankin Kotai, literally alternate attendance, which required every warlord, daimyo, to spend alternating years living in Edo and in their home province. This practice forced them to maintain lavish residences in Edo, strain their finances, and keep their families effectively as hostages, deterring revolt. Land surveys and a strict class system, dividing society into samurai, peasants, artisans, and merchants, cemented the shogunate's authority. While samurai were theoretically the ruling class, in reality, many grew impoverished as peace reduced their need and pay for military service. By the 1610s, tensions with foreign faiths escalated. Christian ideas, introduced by European missionaries, had made significant inroads, particularly in Western Japan. The Tokugawa regime, however, perceived Christianity as a threat to political stability. Persecutions began, reaching a peak with the Shimabara Rebellion, 1637 to 1638, a violent uprising by Christian peasants and ronin, masterless samurai. Its brutal suppression ended Christian influence in Japan for centuries. In 1635 and 1639, a series of edicts, pivotal moment in Japanese history, ushered in the era of Sakoku, the locked country. Japanese were forbidden to leave. Ships capable of foreign travel were destroyed, foreign religious materials banned, and trade limited to a few designated foreign partners. Rumors circulated across Europe of monstrous samurai carrying swords, and Japan disappeared from Western maps almost entirely. Trade persisted, but narrowly. Only the Dutch, on Dejima, a man-made island in Nagasaki, Chinese merchants, and Koreans were granted permission to dock, under strict supervision. Even their cultural influence was tightly controlled, confined to designated quarters with no freedom to proselytize or roam Japan. Yet while Japan closed its doors, it opened its heart to a uniquely Japanese flowering of culture, innovation, and community. Isolation did not mean stagnation. On the contrary, the Edo period saw remarkable urban growth and economic development. Edo, once a sleepy fishing town, transformed into one of the largest cities in the world. Osaka became the nation's kitchen, storing and distributing rice and goods. Kyoto remained the cultural center. Across dozens of castle towns, commerce thrived. Merchants, initially scorned as low-status chonin, townspeople, began to accumulate wealth. Guilds called kabunakama controlled production and trade. Moneylenders emerged, helping fund agricultural work, castle building, and even the lavish lifestyles of bankrupt daimyo. Banks and credit systems developed within city districts. Money became central. Domain taxes were paid in rice, but cities demanded coins. Currency systems evolved, starting with gold, silver, and copper coins, and eventually leading to paper notes issued by local governments. Growth led to infrastructure development. Roads, ports, canals, lodging houses, bridges, the early arteries of Japan's domestic economy. Travel increased. Pilgrimages to Ise shrines or Mount Fuji became more popular, and festival culture spread broadly. With a more complex society and economy, a cultural renaissance erupted. One not controlled by samurai lords or aristocrats, but born from the rhythms and tastes of city life. Many think of ukiyo-e prints, images of beautiful courtesans, actors, and landscapes, but their roots lie in a larger phenomenon called ukiyo, often translated as the floating world. Ukiyo was the urban pleasure culture centered around red light districts, kabuki theaters, tea houses, and poetry clubs. In pleasure quarters like Yoshiwara, Edo, Shimabara, Kyoto, and Shinmachi, Osaka, people from all classes mingled. Samurai with restricted incomes, merchants flush with cash, and wandering poets or artists gathered under lantern lights to enjoy performances, poetry readings, music, or companionship. Ukiyo was egalitarian in its indulgence, creative in its arts, and influential in the culture that followed. This was the era of kabuki, a lively, exaggerated style of drama founded by Izumo no Okuni in 1603. Kabuki plays reflected urban themes, romantic triangles, moral dilemmas, and caricatures of authority, with bold makeup, stylized movement, and elaborate costumes. In the early 1700s, kabuki merged with bunraku, puppet theater, creating intensely dramatic performances. Meanwhile, classical No and Kyogen theater continued in elite circles, preserving ancient traditions. Writers such as Saikaku Ihara and Ueda Akinari penned fictional stories and love satires, shaping early modern Japanese literature. Comic booklets, ihon, and serialized works, kibyoushi, entertained widespread audiences, often with humor and subtle criticism of society or government. While urban pop culture thrived above ground, aesthetic refinement flourished both for commoners and elites. In poetry, Matsuo Basho revolutionized verse with the haiku, short, seasonally focused poems that captured fleeting moments of nature and emotion. His journeys were chronicled in The Narrow Road to the Deep North, an enduring classic of travel writing. Visual art exploded with ukiyo-e, woodblock prints produced in mass but artful editions. Artists like Katsushika Hokusai and Utagawa Hiroshige imagined landscapes, seasons, famous places, and fantastical scenes. These prints, affordable and portable, spread popular imagery through all layers of society, and centuries later heavily influenced Western impressionists. Behind many samurai homes and tea houses lay Zen Buddhist gardens, rock gardens, and chanoyu, the Japanese tea ceremony. Though these tastes originated in elite circles, elements seeped into everyday life. Wabi-sabi, the beauty of imperfection and transience, became a defining aesthetic, influencing pottery, architecture, gardening, and design. Castles built during the Edo period, like Hikone, Matsumoto, Himeji, were not just defensive structures, but statements of power and artistry. Their layered white walls, attacking angle designs, and inland placement ensured a sense of prestige as well as security. Most Japanese remained rural peasants. Farming villages across Japan's terraced paddy fields produced rice under rigorous taxation, often 40 to 50% of yields, and poor conditions. The government enforced agricultural productivity to support the samurai class, and maintain social order. Yet the land was prone to disaster. Crop failures, floods, earthquakes, tsunamis. Significant famines, such as the Kanai famine, 1640s, and Tempo famine, 1830s, claimed thousands of lives. In response, local communities rebuilt irrigation systems, opened common granaries, distributed aid, and organized local education, terracotta. Worse famines sometimes triggered rebellion. The Shimabara Rebellion had already occurred. Later, incidents like the Oshio Heihachiro Uprising, 1837, and other peasant revolts rattled domain lords, though serious suppression always followed. Some progressive lords initiated reforms, modernizing agriculture, reducing taxes, or adopting new crops, sweet potatoes, indigo. Matsudaira Sadanobu of Shirakawa, domain for instance, introduced moral and financial reforms in the 1790s. Farm education deepened. Village schools taught reading, writing, and arithmetic. Even samurai families sometimes sent boys to terracotta, recognizing value in basic literacy as commerce grew. By the late 18th century, cracks in the Tokugawa system became more visible. Samurai were poor. Daimyos were strapped. The land tax economy struggled as rice prices became unstable. Domain debts mounted. Food shortages and inflation bred frustration. In cities, merchants began funding samurai. In Edo, the Honjin inns, reserved for the elite, began being used by samurai to store their kimonos, not so different from idle merchants stacking wealth. The system, once justified by honor and service, was sagging under privatization. Scholarly attention shifted inward. Over 2 centuries of isolation, some Japanese intellectuals studied Western science, medicine, astronomy, engineering, through Dutch books, rangaku, or Dutch learning. They built telescopes, clinical knowledge, water pumps, and even small Western-style maps. At the same time, others turned to Japan's own roots, ancient myths, poetry, Shinto rituals, under a movement called Kokugaku, or national studies. Thinkers like Motori Norinaga emphasized Japan's uniqueness and spiritual heritage. Those pushing both Western and traditional Japanese knowledge laid foundations for what would follow later. Meanwhile, foreign ships loomed on the horizon. British, Russian, and American vessels briefly skirted Japan's ports, mapping coastlines, fishing, challenging sovereignty. The Opium War, 1839–42, in China surprised many in Japan. If Britain could humiliate China, could Japan resist Western demands? Previously loyal samurai and scholars began questioning the bakufu, with some calling for sono joy. Revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. Hidden societies of young samurai, shishi, plotted, assassinated foreign suspects or traitors, and challenged domains that favored appeasement. Seeds of revolt were planted. Not violent yet, but brewing with concern about the future. The existential question: could Japan remain safe, sovereign, and honor its traditions in a rapidly westernizing world? The answer arrived on the horizon, with black ships and weapons of unimaginable power. In July 1853, 4 American warships under Commodore Matthew Perry appeared in Edo Bay. Their hulking black hulls, long-listed sails, modern artillery designed to impress and intimidate were like nothing the Japanese had ever seen. Perry's arrival was not accidental. It was ordered by President Millard Fillmore under the growing doctrine that America and all nations should be able to trade freely. Japan was one of the few countries yet untouched by Western commerce. Perry did not attack. Instead, he presented the Japanese government with letters demanding ports be opened, shipwrecked sailors be treated respectfully, and diplomatic relations established. He left, promising to return the next year. Faced with the mechanical roar of American steam guns and Perry's backup threatening fleet, the shogunate found its military outdated. Their smoothbore cannons, matchlocks, and coastal defenses were decades, if not a century, behind. Tokugawa leadership recognized the need to negotiate. Within months, the Convention of Kanagawa, March 1854, was signed, opening the ports of Shimoda and Hakodate to American ships, ensuring shipwrecked sailors' safety and establishing a small American consulate. But more was coming. In 1858, U.S. envoy Townsend Harris negotiated the Treaty of Amity and Commerce, granting extraterritorial rights to Americans, opening additional ports, Nagasaki, Kobe, Yokohama, Niigata, and allowing import-export of goods. Japan had signed a gunboat treaty, forced into unequal conditions. Within months, Britain, Russia, France, and the Netherlands extracted similar treaties, all unequal. Fixed low tariffs, foreign court jurisdiction, foreign settlement enclaves. Matters worsened as foreign residence sections grew in port cities. Western towns appeared amidst Japanese neighborhoods, confusing and vexing shopkeepers and officials alike. The treaty system shook the foundations of the bakufu. Many saw Tokugawa's concessions as national disgrace. Pro-Western domains, like Satsuma and Choshu, watched and learned how to respond. Anti-foreign samurai prepared, backroom alliances formed. The shogunate seemed weak, divided, vulnerable, one guillotine lurch away from collapse. By 1853–54, Japan's era of isolation had officially ended. But just as significantly, a deeper question emerged. Who should govern Japan, Edo's military lord, or the imperial throne in Kyoto? That question, along with economic hardships and foreign humiliation, soon sparked a movement that would tear down centuries-old order and usher in a radically new Japan. Over 2.5 centuries, Japan's sakoku was more than a wall. It was a crucible. It created a unique civilization, bursting with culture, art, and community, entirely shaped by its own people. Edo, Osaka, Kyoto, and countless smaller towns bore witness to economic innovation and artistic reinvention. Yet beneath the surface, cracks deepened. A struggling samurai class, indebted lords, peasants hanging on by threads of rice, merchants growing powerful but lacking true influence, and intellectuals caught between tradition and Western science. When Commodore Perry arrived with his black ships, he didn't just break a seal. He exposed centuries of closure, coercion, strengths, vulnerabilities, and unsolved tensions. What followed was no mere shift in policy, but a seismic historical turn. One era ended, another dawned. By the time Commodore Perry sailed away in 1854, the Tokugawa shogunate's grip on Japan was tremulous, their inability to fend off foreign pressure, culminating in forced treaties, granting extraterritorial rights to Westerners and stripping Japan of trade autonomy, gnawed at national pride across the empire. Internal tensions, crushed under the surface for generations, began erupting. The slogan, Sono Joy, revere the emperor, expel the barbarians, deeply resonated among samurai and intellectuals, especially in Satsuma and Choshu, domains prematurely exposed to foreign technologies and strategies. They were also among the few domains investing in modern weaponry, steamships, rifles, and Western-style military training, preparing an armed response. By 1862, the assassination of a British official in Kyoto signaled a growing radicalization. The shogunate's attempts to maintain order by organizing punitive expeditions into rebellious provinces only accelerated the crisis. In 1866, crisis struck at home. The Satsuma-Choshu alliance was formally formed, and warlord shogun Yoshinobu launched his final bid to reverse course. The result was a half-hearted military uprising. It failed. In January 1868, a loose coalition, led by Seigo Takamori, liberated Edo of Tokugawa authority with minimal bloodshed, a campaign known as the Bushin War. By April, Kyoto was declared the political center. By October, Emperor Mutsuhito, a young and determined 25-year-old, formally abolished the shogunate and created the Meiji government. This wasn't a peaceful coup. It was a costed realignment of power. The ruling samurai class dissolved. The domains, Han, were replaced with prefectures ruled by imperial appointees. The feudal hierarchy was dismantled, samurai privileges abolished, stipends reduced, and many former warriors destitute. In return, they were promised government jobs or small financial support, sometimes insufficient. With imperial power reaffirmed, Meiji reformers pursued a bold mission: transform Japan into a modern nation-state, capable of standing shoulder to shoulder with the great powers. Political modernization began with a constitution. The 1889 Meiji Constitution created a bicameral parliament, diet, centralized ministries of finance, foreign affairs, and war. While the emperor retained considerable power, power began shifting to bureaucrats and industrialists. Next, industrialization. Across the country, Western-style factories were built, equipped to produce textiles, particularly silk, steel, and shipbuilding. Designed by foreign advisors and staffed by Japanese apprentices, they were testbeds for a wider industrial strategy. The transport revolution was dramatic. Steamships, telegraph lines, national postal service, and railroads connected previously isolated regions. The first railway, built in 1872, spanned Tokyo to Yokohama. By 1890, over 5,000 miles of track crisscrossed Japan. Education underwent transformation. Universal primary education was introduced. All children, boys and girls, received literacy training. Technical schools founded. Elites sent abroad for further study. In 1873, Japan began universal conscription, establishing a modern army and navy drawn from commoners. The age of samurai warfare was officially over. Japan's modernization opened the possibility to project power. Its first major challenge and test came in 1894 during the First Sino-Japanese War. The immediate cause: influence over Korea. The Treaty of Shimonoseki, 1895, sparked an unexpected victory for Japan. China ceded Taiwan and recognized Korean independence. Back home, public celebrations followed. Japan had arrived. Sensing shifting trade and power structures, Japan turned hard for Western alliances. In 1902, a pact was signed with Great Britain, once a former colonial exploiter, a signal of Japan's rising global value. But the real test came from Russia. In 1904, Japan launched a surprise attack on Port Arthur. The Russo-Japanese War, 1904-05, saw Japan defeat the Russian fleet and army. Japanese strategy, modernized forces, and determination prevailed. Japan had defeated a major European power. The victory triggered domestic shifts. Workers and students began campaigning for democratic reform. Strikes occurred. The Peace Preservation Law, 1900, was invoked to suppress dissent, to balance modernity without losing social control. Japan, an ally to Britain and France in World War I, seized opportunities. It occupied German territories across the Pacific and in China. Though its contributions to the Western Front were limited, Japan propped up its naval power in Asia. A domestic boom followed, Japan exported military goods and textiles, but this demand ended with the post-war crash. The nation faced nationalistic tension, economic decline, and the rice riots of 1918 over the rising cost of staple foods. In response, Japan signed the Washington Naval Treaty, 1922, accepting limits on its navy in exchange for equality with Western powers. But militarists, frustrated by foreign controls, grew dissatisfied. Meanwhile, democratic currents flourished. The newspaper lineage, universities, and parties like Rikken Seiyukai and Minseito pushed for a fuller democracy. Yet this fragile democracy was countered by growing militarism. The Manchurian Incident, 1931, triggered by a staged attack, allowed the Kwantung Army to invade Manchuria, defying diplomatic restraint. Japan renamed it Manchukuo and installed the last Qing emperor as a puppet. This marked Japan's definitive shift from diplomatic nation to imperial power backed by military might. Following Manchuria's capture, Japanese conquest in China escalated alarmingly. By 1937, border clashes turned into the Second Sino-Japanese War. Shanghai fell. Nanjing soon did, leading to the horrific rape of Nanjing, a brutal massacre causing hundreds of thousands of civilian deaths. Japan established Nanjing Safety Zone, an entirely hollow title. Expansionists in Tokyo painted this as Japan's final solution to Western humiliation. While they promised a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, in reality, Japan's rule in occupied territories was oppressive. Meanwhile, Western powers grew wary. America froze Japanese assets in 1940, limiting oil exports. Japan faced a supply crisis. The Army and Navy debated, strike or submit. On December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, aiming to neutralize the U.S. Pacific Fleet. They simultaneously struck Allied bases across Southeast Asia. It was the opening salvo of the Pacific War. Initial victories were staggering: Malaya, Singapore, Indonesia, the Philippines, but by mid-1942, Allied forces began turning the tide. The Battle of Midway decimated Japan's sea power. Guadalcanal, Saipan, Leyte Gulf, all major losses. Japan's industrial infrastructure was not ready for total war. Factories were bombed, cities devastated. Civilians perished in bombing raids. Faced with impending invasion, the U.S. dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima, August 6, and Nagasaki, August 9, causing unimaginable devastation. Emperor Hirohito broadcast Japan's capitulation on August 15, 1945. Unconditional surrender followed on September 2nd aboard the USS Missouri. Japan awoke under Allied occupation, led by General Douglas MacArthur. The occupiers had sweeping authority, yet let Japan retain its emperor, this time as a symbolic figurehead. Reforms came swiftly. The military end was formally written into the 1947 Constitution, Article 9, renouncing war. Land reforms redistributed farms. Labor unions blossomed. Women's rights improved. Suffrage granted in 1946. Public education focused on democratic values. War criminals were tried. Japan pivoted to peaceful reconstruction. By 1952, the San Francisco Treaty restored sovereignty. Japan aligned with the West and joined GATT, UNESCO, and other international organizations. Ambitious planning paid off. Japan's government instituted MITI, the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, coordinating industrial strategy. The Korean War, 1950–53, spurred demand for Japanese goods. Export-led growth took Japan from widespread devastation to global economic dominance. By the 1960s, Japan Inc. was pumping out cars, electronics, steel, and ships. 1964 saw the opening of the Tokyo Olympics, symbolizing Japan's return to the world. In 1973, the oil shock tested Japan's resilience. They responded by investing in energy efficiency and high-tech electronics. Soon, Japan led global markets in autos, Toyota, Nissan, Honda, consumer electronics, Sony, Panasonic, Sharp, and heavy industry, steel, shipbuilding. Cultural exports emerged alongside products. From anime, manga, video games to J-pop, Japanese culture captivated global audiences. From Hayao Miyazaki's films to Pokémon, the world now knew Pokémon and Tokyo fashion. Quality education. Tokyo and Kyoto's universities nurtured innovative research, computing, robotics, biotech. Infrastructure remained excellent. Bullet trains, clean streets. Japan was safe, literate, elderly, yet youthful in energy. But 1989's Leo kicked in. Land prices collapsed, banks foundered, and Japan entered the lost decade. Growth moseyed to 1%, and deflation hovered. By the 2000s, Japan looked different. Aging population, low birth rate, high life expectancy. The ratio of working age to elders dropped. Social safety nets were strained. Economy? Mixed results. Japan rebounded, 2000s, but China and South Korea overtook in electronics and automotive presence. Politically, Japan supported U.S. policy in Asia, Security Alliance, hosted global summits, and participated in climate negotiations. Culture-wise, Japanese soft power boomed. Anime in streaming platforms, martial arts, poetry, traditional arts remain vibrant.